All right, lastly, in 8.3, we're discussing the way that population and society are interacting. So, what are human thoughts and actions and ideas and concerns about the way human population is changing? So, there are a ton of different economic and societal factors that are going to affect the fertility in a nation, meaning how their population is growing or not growing. One of these things is access to contraceptives. So, in a lot of nations, because of governmental or religious reasons or just poverty reasons, contraceptives are not available to women and families. The acceptance of contraceptive use, so a lot of these countries or a lot of different groups of nations are not accepting of the use of contraceptives, Catholics being one of them. The level of women's rights. If women are not seen as equals, then their rights and their health and their decision making about having children is not as weighted equally. It's not weighted as equally. A lot of cultural influences affect the societal the societal ideas of fertility, and we're going to talk about that in particular in Brazil. Level of affluence. Affluence is directly affected or has a direct impact on fertility. We know that as part of the IPAT model. Affluence is one of the letters. The importance of child labor. If the child labor force is a huge part of the labor and part of the economy of a nation or of a culture or of a group of nations, then there's going to be a push to have more children because we need to keep that labor force filled. And then the ability of governmental support for retirees. So as our society is aging and as that pyramid might be shifting, we have to make sure that we have the resources to take care of the elderly who are not working anymore. Um, so family planning is a key approach for controlling population growth. So family planning by definition is the effort to plan the number and spacing of one's children. So how many children do you want to have and when in your life as a woman do you want to have them? And birth control includes all efforts to reduce the frequency of a pregnancy. One of those might be contraception, which is defined as a deliberate attempt to prevent pregnancy despite engaging in sexual intercourse. So this is an interesting statistic down here that the rates of contraception use range from 84% in China and the UK. So China being a large part and due in large part to the one child policy and the governmental approach to lowering their population growth. And then in less than 10% in, I think it said, up to 12 African nations. So there is very little contraception in a lot of Africa, in a lot of African nations. The low contraceptive use may be a combination of low availability, especially in rural areas, especially as we get into third world countries, the less affluent countries, and we move into the rural parts of it away from the cities. There isn't the same kind of healthcare that's not available there. And then also a lack of acceptance due to religious or cultural doctrines. In some places, in some cultures, some religions, again, Catholicism, do not accept the use of contraception, and in places where that the religion and the culture are highly intertwined, that could lead to low contraception use. So access to family planning allows a woman to decide when in her reproductive window when she wants to have children. So the reproductive window is from the first menstrual cycle until the last menstrual cycle. So 13, 14, 12 years old to about 50 when they hit menopause. And so the book has another picture in it that shows all of these babies colored to show that it says that a woman can have up to 25 babies in her reproductive window, which is insane, but biologically possible. But most women choose not to have children that often, and so they get to choose when in their reproductive window they want to have children. So this shows that from the first period, then through delaying childbirth to focus on education and career, so it might not be until late 20s or early 30s that they start having children, and then they would space out the births within the reproductive window that they're having children using contraception, and then ending the reproductive window deciding my family is big enough with continued contraception or continued birth control, family planning. So family planning programs are working around the world. A lot of rapidly growing countries have implemented them. And okay, so it says most less intrusive than China's one-child policy. But if you recall, before they implemented the one-child policy, they actually were able to drop their population growth rate by 1% just through these family planning programs, and then they got more severe with the one-child program. In India, if we're talking more intrusive than China, they tried to, in the 70s, tried to introduce a required sterility. Is that the word I'm looking for? Basically, they made their men get sterilized in order to stop having children. They made them go through the process to not be able to have babies anymore. So that's very, very severe, even more severe than China's one-child policy. But there are some that are less severe that worked well also. So for example, in Thailand, they achieved a reduction in growth rate from 2.3 to 0.4%. That's a big reduction, 1.9%. From about, what is that, about 50 years through just increased education of family planning and improved access to contraceptives. So just by teaching the people about their options, getting them educated. Remember, we talked about how education is always a great choice when it comes to solving human problems. They were able to really drop that growth rate in Thailand. So this empowering of women also reduces fertility rates. So it says in order to reduce fertility rates, women must be given equality and decision-making power and access to education and job opportunities. So they need to be part of the decision-making. They need to be in the government. They need to have a say in the laws that are being made about their own bodies, about having children, about families, because they are the ones who are creating the families with their bodies, and then for the most part taking care of the families, right? The majority of the world still depends on mothers and often solely mothers for raising the family. And also access to education and job opportunities. So as a woman gets more educated and starts to have more job opportunities, fertility rates drop because now they can have a family in addition to having these other things. So it's not as possible to have as many children. Or they may want to delay having children to continue working on their career. So their role goes from solely mother to many things, as it is here in the United States. So these equal rights that are increasing have also led women to have the ability to make the reproductive decisions that they want for themselves. They get to decide when and how many children they have. And this has led to a further drop in fertility rates and overall better care for children. Studies have shown that when fertility rates drop, the children are when the education increases, so fertility rates drop, the children are better cared for and more educated themselves. So this graph right here shows on the y-axis total fertility rate, so how many children the amount of children each woman is having, and the female secondary school enrollment rate, so the percentage of women that are enrolled in high school, basically, you're in secondary school. So in Ethiopia, that looks about less than 5% of women are enrolled in secondary school. And their total fertility rate is 6.5, more than 6.5. So each woman is having more than 6.5 children. Very low education, very high fertility rate. In Cambodia, only 10% are enrolled in high school, five children per woman. Kenya and Guatemala, about 30%, and we see 4.5 to 5 children per woman. In India and Syria, we're between 3 and 4%, or I'm sorry, we're at 40% of women enrolled. We're between 3 and 4 as a total fertility rate. Then it just even continues dropping down here. South Africa, almost 100% of women are enrolled, and their total fertility rate's about 3. So again, it's not a perfect straight line, but we can definitely see that there is a correlation between increasing education of women and lowering of total fertility rate. So increasing affluence lowers fertility. So poor society, we've talked about this, poor societies tend to show higher population rates than others. We can see right here, this is the rate of natural increase, so the percentage of which the population is growing. So North America has a very low growth rate, and the per capita income is the highest on this graph. Europe is over here. They're not growing right now, remember, and they have still a very high per capita income. Australia and the South Pacific is still growing a little bit, but still a high income. As we drop to Latin America and the Caribbean, the growth rate increases, much lower income. Same thing down here with Asia, although they're not that much higher than Australia and the South Pacific, but we can definitely see that Africa's rate of natural increase, they are growing, and they're a very poor continent as a whole. And the reason for this is because economic factors are tied closely to population growth. So poverty exacerbates population growth. So uneducated, impoverished families have more children, whether this might be because of a need lack of education, lack of birth control, lack of good health care, So they want to have children to make sure that they'll be taken care of, that their children will survive. If they live in rural areas or live on a farm or part of the labor force, they need to have children to support the family. So poverty exacerbates means makes worse population growth, and then rapid population growth worsens poverty. As rapid population growth is happening, there's not enough resources. People are living off of less. It's an example of a feedback loop. So the poverty increases population growth increases poverty, and we're just getting more and more people and more poverty. Positive feedback loop. And not only does it have an effect on poverty, but we're also affecting the environment. So it says that most of the next billion humans added to the human population, so the next billion people that are born, will come from emerging economies, which means that these are impoverished nations or economies that are still growing. They haven't quite, maybe not industrialized yet, maybe are not successful. So now we're not adding these people to successful economies. So we look at the United States, a place where, yes, there's poverty here, but overall, we're doing very well. There's healthcare, there's resources, there's education here. We're not adding people here. We're adding people in impoverished nations where there isn't education, where there isn't healthcare, where the infrastructure, the governments aren't the same as ours. And so these countries will continue to be economically strained. It is that there's another positive feedback loop. The poorer, strained countries are having more children because of their lack of access to healthcare and education. And so because of that, then they get even more economically strained. It's a positive feedback loop. And then unfortunately, this environmental degradation is happening because of poverty. So in countries or in regions where there's a lot of poverty, they need to farm to make, let's say it's a rural area. They're going to need to farm no matter what. So they're going to farm land that isn't ready to be farmed, and they're going to over-harvest it, and they're going to deplete that farmland so it can't be farmed anymore, and now they're out of farmland. So the environmental degradation is enhanced because of poverty. On the other hand, expanding wealth, so affluence can also have a huge environmental impact. We talked about this. A is part of that impact equation. So wealth can produce even more severe environmental impacts than poverty because affluence is built on unsustainable levels of resource consumption. Right here, sitting in my house, I have 3 lights on around me. I'm using fossil fuels, and I'm not rich, but I have access to money and access to technology enough to keep my lights on. And it's not like that in all parts of the world. So the addition of every one person from a wealthy nation, like the United States, has the same impact as 3.4 Chinese people. So adding 1 US citizen is the same environmental impact as adding 3.4 Chinese people, 8 Indian people, or 14 people from Afghanistan. So 1 new human born in the US has the same environmental impact as 14 new people born in Afghanistan. And that's because of our ecological footprint, that we're living beyond our means. Okay. So the amount of biologically productive land available to us is called biocapacity, and that's not changing. The Earth has a given amount of biologically productive land that we can grow things on, that we can make resources from. And so as humans' ecological footprint exceeds this, which it has, you know that. So here's our biocapacity. Then that's the amount that one planet Earth has. As our ecological footprint moves above that, we're moving into what's called an overshoot. And then we have what's called an ecological deficit or debt. So we are living beyond our means. We now have this gap between what we're taking and what the planet can provide for us. It's hopeful that, sorry.